Chris, thank you very much for including me in this panel. I think the fundamental idea of this book is profound and profoundly important. It does make me think of a saying. The future is unknowable. We can't really understand what's happening in the present, and we misinterpret the past. From my fondness for this saying, you will appreciate that longer ago than Jeff, I was a student of philosophy. And that makes me most sympathetic to what I take as the fundamental idea, which is knowledge versus ignorance as ways to think about things, why it is the future is unknowable, and we don't really understand what's happening in the present, and why it's easy to misinterpret the past. This is a way of thinking about it completely different from the incentive story so common to economists, or what the book rightly calls the incentives fetish, that we have to everywhere find some kind of conflict of interest or some kind of basically fraudulent behavior going on, when it is, after all, much more direct, and I agree with the book, much more realistic to understand the lack of knowledge. So the independence fetish is extremely important in many ways. Now, I'll just mention it also informs debates on corporate governance in this country and other places, where we would prefer to have someone totally independent and ignorant than someone knowledgeable and possibly conflicted. Thinking about knowledge and ignorance, it makes me reflect that I have made plenty of mistakes myself my whole life long, but particularly I'm thinking of as a chief executive officer, which I was for about 13 years. Looking back on these mistakes, the line which sums them up always is, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Afterwards, when you think about it, it gets hard to remember why you thought it was a good idea. And this indeed has a lot to do with this hindsight bias so well discussed in the book. Here's a quote of interest. It seems safe to say that nobody anticipated anything like the current crisis. Collapses in domestic asset markets, widespread bank failures, bankruptcies on the part of many firms, and a much more severe real downturn than even the most negative-minded had anticipated. As is all too often the case, we find ourselves playing theoretical catch-up, trying after the fact to develop a framework for thinking about events that have already happened. This is Paul Krugman, writing in 1998 about the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And of course, it applies to the current and other crises. Thinking of hindsight bias, the book says, in hindsight, people consistently exaggerate what could have been anticipated in foresight. I think this is quite true. And the book goes on to suggest, which I also think is right, is that's why there develops a certain faith that since we could have anticipated it, why therefore we can write some new regulations which will mechanically stop problems from happening next time. The knowledge versus ignorance notion, on the other hand, which seems to me right, worries about the lack of anybody's having enough knowledge to do this. Arnold Kling is an interesting writer on this topic. He's cited in the book in a paper called Not What They Had in Mind, a most interesting paper, by the way. He wrote, the actions of policymakers and regulators contribute to financial fragility, obviously true as documented in this book. And they contribute to financial fragility, not because they're ill-intentioned, but because they do not know, but here's the real point, they cannot know any more than anyone else can know what the future results of their present actions will be. And as Friedman and Krauss rightly say, that's true of private actors as well. But in the case of government actors, and Jeff stressed this in his remarks, the regulatory mistakes are imposed by force on everybody. To state what is obvious, of course, it is a mistake to imagine that politicians and regulators are purely public-spirited. We know this well. They're affected by personal ambition, love of power, assertion of authority, resentment of those who make more money than they do, and defense of their previous actions, trying to bail out their personal reputations. The notable case of this was, of course, the Federal Savings and Loans Insurance Corporation in the 1980s, which did all kinds of sinful activities, trying to make up for the mistakes they made before. Arguably, another case of this would be OFEO, the regulator of Fannie and Freddie, which sponsored and promoted a big issue of preferred stock by Fannie Mae very late in the game, when they must have known the buyers of that stock had a high probability of being wiped out, as they subsequently were. But there's even a more important issue here with regulators and governments when it comes to banking, which is they always have an interest, and they always do, promote the financing of the government by the banks themselves. Anybody with an inkling of financial history knows throughout financial history is a strong theme, which is that governments create banks in order to finance the government. And they also create central banks to do that, by the way. If we want to understand why sovereign debt has a zero risk weighting, it's because of the self-interest in governments in getting their debt bought by somebody. Well, moving on here, I'm often asked, will we learn the lessons of the crisis? And my answer to this is yes. We learn the lessons after every crisis. But somehow it doesn't prevent the next crisis. Arnold Kling has, in this paper I mentioned, Not What They Have in Mind, has a discussion of this where he takes, I think in a quite convincing way, the three lessons regulators and politicians drew, and economists and theoreticians drew from the crisis of the 1980s and applied as solutions, all of which then became important causes of the crisis of the 2000s. And these three lessons are the importance of stressing securitization and the superiority of securitization over simply lending people money. That stress on securitization you see reflected in the risk-based capital standards, which Jeff so correctly discussed. That was one. The second was the importance of mark-to-market accounting. Remember, the savings and loan regulators of the 1980s were severely attacked and criticized for allowing their charges to maintain assets on the books at over-the-market prices. So the lesson drawn was you had to have mark-to-market accounting. And the third was you had to have risk-based capital. And once you have that, you have to have reliance on credit ratings by credit rating agencies, which also the book discusses in a very helpful fashion. So these three lessons, Kling says, and I think he's right, all became solutions which were imposed by government policy, by regulation, and became prime causes, or at least aggravators, of the financial crises. Now, when it comes to knowledge, I do want to touch on this. Of course, complexity is difficult and causes difficulties, but there's more than complexity at work here. The book says the modern world is too complex to allow even experts to make accurate predictions of future events. Seems to me the world has always been such, even when it was less complex, that you could not predict future events. Financial firms have been getting in trouble, and investments have been crashing, and booms and busts have been happening, and banks have been busting in worlds much less complex than what we have. So I don't think it's complexity, really. I think what causes the fundamental lack of knowledge or ignorance is instead recursiveness or self-reference. That is to say, markets and actions and politics and policy are always self-referring, and they're recursive, and the decisions we take feed back into the next thing that happens, which feeds back in innumerable ways, which are and turn out to be non-predictable, or at least you can't successfully. You, of course, can make predictions, but you can't make successful predictions. For example, AAA mortgage securities were originally thought to be safe. Why? Because AAA mortgage securities were safe when these rules were made up. They were simply stating the truth. But because of the policies of governments and the actions of private actors, all of whom believed that AAA securities were safe, this made them risky. This is a wonderful example of recursiveness or self-reference. So the very belief that all these things were safe is what caused them to be a disaster. In similar fashion, the very belief that house prices in the U.S. could not fall on a nationwide basis, a pretty reasonable belief, because it was so strongly held, caused house prices to fall, and to fall by a third, about $7 trillion worth on a nationwide basis. And this self-reference is one of the most important reasons why we're unable to see the future and even to see the results of our own actions. Friedman and Krauss very nicely sum things up at the end of their book with these words. Nobody should be blamed for honest mistakes or even for ideological thinking, both of which are inherent to the human condition. Undoubtedly true. They note regulatory ignorance and ideology, apparently transmitted to regulators by modern democracy's most trusted academic experts. Good thought. The more we believe in the theories of the academic experts, perhaps it turns out these theories are self-falsifying by the actions of markets. Friedman and Krauss go on to say, one has to wonder whether modern democracy has a potentially fatal flaw, the mistakes that flow from the cognitive limitations of all too human decision makers. I have a little quibble here. I don't think this is a mistake of democracy. I think it's a mistake of bureaucracy. And the bureaucratic state, in my judgment, is hardly a democratic state. So that what we really have at stake in this book is a contrast between reality on one hand and the Woodrow Wilsonian belief in experts on the other hand, and the ability of experts isolated from democratic pressures to manage society in the best interest of all those ignorant people who don't know what's good for themselves. At an even more fundamental level, in my view, this Wilsonian view is in fact Hobbesian. Think of the fundamental social contract according to Hobbes. It is to create a sovereign with absolute power in order to be safe. That's what the populace does in Leviathan. Because we wish to be safe, we give all the power to the sovereign. Well, think about what modern societies do in order to make themselves safe. They give all the power to bureaucratic organizations who are like Hobbes' sovereign outside of democratic processes. And we have large discussions about how we have to maintain the so-called independence of these experts from mere democratic pressures. So I don't think that view is right, but we should not oppose to it an opposite view that because markets are efficient, and I do believe they are efficient, but we should not think because they're efficient that they can know the future. They can't. So, in the words of the book, cognitive limitations and honest mistakes, which are inherent to the human condition, and therefore create the inability to know the future, even the results of our own actions, applies to both bureaucrats and governments, and to entrepreneurs and markets. And any theory which does not take this fundamental truth into account will be inadequate. From this we can see that most theories put out by economists, journalists, politicians, and others are inadequate. Thank you, Jeff, for pointing this out in such a striking fashion in your book.